This conversation was a train wreck from the start. Her stubbornness gave him zero hope of a good outcome. But the Duke wasn't giving up on changing her mind. He just needed to figure out why she was refusing. It was easy to assume it was about the money or the terms, but those were small things, easily fixed. Hell, he was ready to bend over backwards just to get a yes from her. She looked into his honest eyes, felt the pull of his smooth voice, but stayed silent. Resisting the main character's charm was tough. The Duke kept pushing because she was the first handler that Kazan hadn't, messed up. You could see why he was so intense, but she wasn't backing down. She had her own goal in life, to live in peace and quiet, bothering no one. See, 5 years ago, she started remembering her past life, and it felt like she'd stepped into the pages of a novel. She even thought that if she was the main character, her life would soon take a turn for the better. But nothing changed. She was still an orphan, and a commoner at that. Honestly, she was lucky to find a headmistress who became like a mother to her. Thanks to her, the girl was able to become a trainer and land a great job. Except she's not training puppies, but fearsome and majestic dragons. And she got lucky with her charge too. I mean, her Lu was a real beauty. You really couldn't take your eyes off the dragon's snow-white scales. In this world, dragons weren't rare. Some raised them like livestock, others kept them as pets. But no dragon was ever idle. And to make sure they listened to people, you needed trainers like her. Because some of them breathed fire, you know? Others swam in the ocean's depths, or flew high among the clouds. Everyone understood these creatures had insane power. They could tear everything apart if they wanted to. Meanwhile, Lu was feeling a little mischievous, and she grabbed the trainer's clothes. No time for games right now, though. Cleaning first, then everything else. And before long, Lu's chambers were sparkling clean. But all this tidiness didn't exactly cheer up the sulking dragon. Lu could keep pouting if she wanted, but the girl had some special treats just for him. That worked like a charm. The dragon was already begging for a snack, completely forgetting what she was upset about. Her puppy dog eyes were melting the trainer's heart. She really loved this little drama queen. And she fed her well, happy that Lu was in a good mood today. But at first, the dragon didn't have much of an appetite at all. Soon we'll have to see if she's ready to be ridden or not. Just then, one of the junior trainers came running into the enclosure. He needed Lithia's help like yesterday. Thompson was in trouble, again, still struggling to tame that rock-type dragon. And those things are supposed to be the slowest, least aggressive dragons out there. Or so they say. But something clearly went sideways here. Pretty soon that dragon's gonna make Thompson his lunch, and not even blink. The dude was about to pass out from sheer terror. Just then, Lithia showed up on the battlefield, riding her awesome Lu. Thompson instantly forgot his fear, because his hate for Lithia ran deeper. He was yelling, cursing, totally forgetting he was just egging the dragon on. Unlike him, Lithia knew exactly how screwed they were, but she was ready to leave him to his fate if he didn't cut the crap. Before they could finish, the dragon went on the attack. After a little growling, the dragon calmed down and even reached out to Lithia. Guess kindness and treats really did the trick. A minute later, they were hugging like they were best buds. The dragon and the trainer were totally in sync, like that whole meltdown never happened. Turns out, the dragon was just in pain, and Thompson didn't bother to figure out why she was acting up. The other trainers were watching Lithia work her magic, and they couldn't believe what they were seeing. Meanwhile, Lithia was helping her dragon out by getting rid of this growth that was bugging her. And it wasn't just any growth, it was the seeds of some nasty sungrass. She wasn't blaming anyone, but her coworker had other ideas about the whole thing. It's always easier to pass the buck, and then rough someone up because they're weaker, right? Lydia couldn't stand to watch, so she defended the kid. I mean, he's a student, and Thompson's supposed to be his mentor. Why doesn't he know basic care? It was hard to miss her point, but the guy was playing dumb, acting like he didn't hear a thing. Lydia had no problem repeating herself. Thompson practically begged the dragon to go wild, slapping a saddle on it and ignoring its injury. And she was 100%, no, 1,000% sure she was right. So, things escalated straight to Director Ashar, who was absolutely losing it, though he was mostly taking it out on her. Lydia was clueless what she'd done wrong. She was the one who stopped the dragon from hurting anyone. The dragon trainer was totally out of it, and the camp rules say another trainer has to step in when that happens. Yeah, that's the rule, but Thompson's got a big shot backing him, someone who funds the whole camp. So, if she wants to keep her job, She needs to watch what she does and says. Lydia better remember, nobody's irreplaceable, and nobody's gonna let her quit on her own terms either. That was another part of the problem. As much as it sucked to admit, the boss was right about everything. That was the end of the conversation, and Lithia left the stuffy office. The girl knew perfectly well that the only thing she was really good at was training dragons, which is why she was clinging to this job. Just then, she overheard Thompson and some other guys talking trash about her again, out of pure jealousy. It stung to hear all those nasty rumors about her, but she had to put up with it, because she needed to help the kids at the orphanage, so she couldn't just walk away from this. Meanwhile, Lou's owner came to visit, and he was amazed by how docile the dragoness was. Clearly, Count Olbart was more than happy with the results. He was even willing to hang around the camp for a few days to reconnect with Lou, though he couldn't dedicate all his time to it. What's more, the guy would have been stoked if Lithia had ditched the camp and started working for his family. But Lithia turned him down, saying she was too green and had a ton to learn. Suddenly, Lou snarled and reared up, ready to attack. But the girl couldn't figure out who she was targeting. Lithia tried to calm her down, but Lou wouldn't chill. Turns out, Duke Albrandt had just arrived in Asher's territory on his dragon. So, first thing the Duke did was head straight to Asher's office and started digging through the documents. The guy had heard this place was supposed to be the best dragon training camp around, which is why he was here today. Asher was practically ready to kiss Duke Albrandt's boots, but the Duke didn't even bat an eye. Anyway, the Duke was planning on tasking this camp with training a dragon. Asher couldn't pass up that kind of opportunity, though he figured they'd be training dragons for knights. That's where he messed up, because the guy was talking about his personal dragon. In other words, Albrandt was looking for someone who could be his personal handler. The director wasn't thrilled with this idea, and tried to talk the guest out of it, since he could end up hurting his own dragon. Honestly, only the Duke himself could probably handle a dragon like that, and who knows what happened to his family's handler. But the director doesn't need to worry about any of that. The Duke's already thought it all through for him. Besides, it's not up to the guys to make this decision anyway. Meanwhile, Rick relayed the director's message about a general assembly to Lithia. It was weird, and she couldn't figure out what all the fuss was about. As much as she didn't want to go, she had to, and finish Lou and Count Albrandt's training. She saw how bummed the guy was, but promised to write down Lou's favorite treat recipe for him next time. Meanwhile, all the camp's beast trainers gathered at the first training field. Lithia was the last to arrive, which pissed off the director yet again. But she barely even noticed him, because Duke Albrandt had completely captured her attention. Something about that guy really set off alarm bells for the main character. Just then, Asher launched into a speech, announcing that he'd gathered everyone to choose a trainer for the Duke's dragon. Participation wasn't mandatory, but anyone confident in their abilities could give it a shot. The thing is, Agric's dragons only chose members of the Albrandt family, so almost nothing was known about them, which meant there was a huge risk of provoking the dragon, even to the point of, well, let's just say things could get messy since nobody knew its habits. Everyone there understood the risks, but they couldn't pass up such a huge opportunity to make a name for themselves. Lithia hesitated. She knew she could win, but the duchy was too far from the capital, and she'd have to leave. Thompson, seeing her hesitation, immediately decided to mess with her. He figured she was just faking being smart and talented, and was actually a nobody. Lithia didn't take the bait, but her friend, without a second thought, popped him one to shut him up. The guy and the girl would have kept arguing if they hadn't caught the director's evil eye. That's the only thing that made Thompson back off and leave the girls alone. The friends were quietly talking, and it turned out Lithia wasn't going to participate in the selection because of the orphanage. The main character just didn't get that she should live her own life and not worry about everyone else. Even the head of the orphanage would tell her off right now. Just then, the lottery started. Lithia still didn't participate because she'd chosen a quiet life here. Still, if things go south, she'll step in. But she'd rather not, because the Duke is way too much like a romance novel's main character. Messing with a situation like this is just asking for trouble. The selection process kept rolling, but nobody could handle that dragon. Some guys nearly lost their pants, others their eyebrows, and the dragon was loving it. Looked real happy causing chaos. Comforting her friend, Lithia realized taming this dragon was going to be a real pain. Meanwhile, Thompson was about to jump into the game. He just strolls right up to the chillin' dragon and starts patting its side like they're old buddies. Lithia was the first to realize what a bonehead move that was. Took her archenemy almost 2 days to even start figuring out what was happening. The dragon's intentions were clear as day in its open jaws. Someone's time was almost up. Lithia had to act fast, so she used her musical instrument to draw the dragon's attention to herself. The other trainers scrambled for their magic gear, realizing things were going south fast. Meanwhile, Thompson just kept screaming, yelling for help, thrashing around, which only pissed off the dragon more. Lithia couldn't let this jerk bite the dust, even though it would have made her life a whole lot easier. But her conscience wouldn't shut up, so she locked eyes with the dragon. She wasn't about to get any closer, without the okay from such a smart creature. The dragon was clearly warning everyone to stay back, without going full-on berserk. But Thompson and the others were too dense to see the obvious. First, save the dude, then deal with everything else. So, she waited for the dragon to chill a bit, then took a tiny step back. But it was too soon, and the dragon started roaring again. Good thing nothing bad happened. Turns out, the dragon just wanted a hug. Yeah, he could have just wrapped her in his wings. But no. He had to lick her face and head with that sandpaper tongue of his. Nobody saw that coming, not even the girl. The Duke and the camp director were just as thrown by what they were seeing. But Albrant got over his surprise quick, and now he's just disappointed in some of the staff here. He'd deal with that later, though. Right now, he was more interested in the girl and his dragon. Guess it was love at first lick for them. The Duke was happy with her, too, since she was the only one who actually followed protocol and won over his pet. That being the case, he was ready to put Lithia in charge of training Kazen. And now here they are in the director's office, and she's got to explain why she can't accept the guy's generous offer. And it wasn't about Ashar getting ticked off. It was about the orphanage she cared so much about. Back in the day, she decided to help the director and the younger kids at the orphanage so they could live happily without a trace of fear. Lithia didn't say all that out loud, but she apologized to the Duke for refusing and left. Albrant didn't get her logic. She could have worked with the rarest dragon in the world and been bonded to it. But she turned it all down, and Kazin probably won't accept another trainer. So, to figure out his next move, the Duke started digging into the girl's file. It showed she'd hardly ever worked with dragons from the Asharian Empire. She mostly trained foreign dragons. Still, the camp would be losing a pretty promising and talented handler if things went south. And honestly, if it weren't for Papa Thompson, Lithia would be in a totally different spot here. But Albrant wasn't interested in the sob story. A trainer's useless if the dragon rejects them. Besides, if Ashar isn't happy with Lithia, he can always try training his boy himself. Yeah, and it wasn't even clear if Lithia would become the Duke's personal handler. With that, Albrant wrapped up his visit. But as a parting gift, he told the director he was leaving Kazen here, giving him a chance to get better acquainted with the dragon. That news didn't exactly thrill the director, so as soon as the Duke left, he called Lithia in. Lithia, on the other hand, was pretty stoked about this unexpected twist of fate, but she quickly snapped out of it, realizing it wasn't exactly the greatest idea. Besides, she couldn't take on an Agrix dragon, since she already had way too many under her wing. Truth is, no one else in the camp could handle Kazan like she could. And since there wasn't an official training request, all she had to do was basic care. Still, Lithia wasn't exactly jumping for joy, since Thompson caused this whole mess, and she's the one stuck cleaning it up. But the director was powerless. You don't question the Duke's decisions, you just follow them. So Lithia decided to quit, but who's gonna let her, right? Nobody. I mean, the poor dragons she takes care of didn't do anything wrong. She can't just ditch them. That was a low blow, hitting where it hurts. But the director had a point. If she left, her charges would be totally screwed without her. It was a tough choice, but in a way, it was also a no-brainer. Lithia agreed, but this time she had a few conditions. She knows how the director operates. She was only going to feed, walk, and clean the dragon, nothing more. Those were such minor things that the director agreed instantly. Lithia had just saved his bacon. Evening came, and a tired Lithia brought Kazana his dinner. She knew the dragon was anxious about the change of scenery, so she wasn't surprised by his sudden outburst. Okay, the dragon's hungry, but he needs to chill. Lithia stopped him dead in his tracks with one hand before he could get to the food cart. The dragon didn't see that coming. How dare a human keep him from grub when he's starving? But his growling didn't faze Lithia, so she stood her ground. The dragon had no choice but to flop on the floor and give her puppy dog eyes. Kazan was so freaking adorable that the girl started to lose her focus. She couldn't stay mad at such a cute dragon for long, so she let him start chowing down. Clearly, Kazen's used to being treated differently. Sounds like nobody's ever laid down the law with him, which is why he gets away with being a rascal. The dragon scarfed it down fast, and Lithia's hands were itching to start training, but she couldn't let that happen. But she can take Kazen for a walk, right? No sooner did she get the harness on the dragon than he took off like a rocket. Dragons don't act like that around here. So Lithia yanked the reins, and Kazen ate pavement. Seriously, how dare she treat him like that? He's a proud dragon, he won't stand for it. But Lithia was just itching to whip him into shape and teach that big lug some manners. He absolutely hated it, but the girl wouldn't back down from what she wanted. While she was busy doing her thing, Lithia didn't notice the Duke walk in and start watching her intently. This was pretty much what he expected. A girl like Lithia wouldn't just leave Kazen to fend for himself. The moment the dragon saw his master, he rushed over for a hug. The guy felt a little guilty for being late and not getting to his friend sooner. Lithia found it weird seeing the Duke so carefree and happy. He always seemed so cold and distant before. She was so lost in thought that she didn't immediately notice Albrecht was already talking to her. He could see she was taking good care of Kazen, even if she acted like she wasn't. Still, he was really curious and interested, because Lithia had managed to win over his dragon. So, she needs to remember that she can change her mind anytime and accept his job offer. Plus, it was kind of fun seeing how long Lithia could resist Kazen's charms. Something about those words set her on edge, and none of her pleas for help to her colleagues had gotten any positive responses. Same thing happened in Ashar. Nobody wanted to help her out. So, she was stuck dealing with her problems and a mountain of work all by herself. Still, she couldn't abandon her charges and their owners, even though she was dead on her feet. Like, for Lou and the Earl, it was their last day at camp, and the guy was bummed to say goodbye to the trainer. The guy couldn't figure out why such a talented girl, the youngest trainer to ace the exam with the highest score, couldn't find a job in the Empire. Lithia wasn't dumb, and she knew that dragons played a huge role in the power struggles of the nobles and elite. So, it's important for everyone to have a talented trainer on hand, someone who soon gets power too, since they can raise a dragon to their owner's specs. But thanks to the director, that wasn't in the cards for Lithia, but she was still happy just being around the dragons. Besides, there aren't many places outside the training center where you can work with so many different dragons. The Earl didn't expect Lithia to have zero ambition, so he wanted her to value herself more and strive for bigger things. After all, fish can never thrive in water that's too clean. It was weird to hear something like that, and to get a gift too, since Lithia just loved dragons and didn't need anything more. Unfolding the scarf, she saw a beautiful gemstone, and for the first time in her life, she thought the Earl might be right. Though it was all probably nonsense, she could sell the stone and try to hire a priest. Suddenly, Lithia felt someone behind her, but when she turned around, she couldn't believe it was the Duke and her mother superior. And that was strange, especially when the man left them to talk and went to see Kazen himself. The mother superior wanted to talk to her former charge, and she had something to say. But she wasn't rushing to get to the point, and just sipped tea in the girl's room. The woman was silent for a long time, but when she finally spoke, the first thing she asked about was the Duke's dragon. It was hard for Lithia to describe the dragon. She always felt like it radiated a red glow. Maybe it was because of the creature's special magic. He's really beautiful and intelligent. It's impossible not to fall for him. The Reverend Mother wasn't surprised by that reaction, which is why she really wanted the girl to become Kazen's personal trainer. After all, the woman had even heard in town that some talented trainer had tamed his Grace's dragon's wild temperament. Besides, the Duke personally visited the orphanage, made a generous donation, and even brought a priest. The priest was happy to treat the children, so there's nothing to worry about. But it wasn't just the children who received help, but also Mother Superior, which is why she was able to come visit her ward today. That was the best news Lithia had received in a long time. The Reverend Mother strongly urged Lithia not to miss the chance the Duke was giving her. An opportunity like this wouldn't come again. Plus, she always felt a little guilty that Lithia had to work so hard because of her. But at the same time, she was incredibly proud of her strong girl. Meanwhile, Albrecht and Kazen were chilling under a tree, hiding from the sun. But they quickly noticed Lithia's arrival. The girl didn't beat around the bush and said she'd thought over the Duke's offer. The man was definitely stoked that Lithia had changed her tune. and he was ready to go over the details of his proposal with her again. The decision was made, which meant it was time to say goodbye to the kids at the orphanage Lithia looked after. She swore to the kids and the Mother Superior that she wouldn't disappear and would write letters. No one was mad at her, though, because the girl needed to learn to put herself first, and they'd always understand and support her here. Melissa and Rick even came to say goodbye to Lydia, since they'd worked side by side for quite a while and become friends. Lydia was super happy to see them, especially since they brought a farewell gift. News that would really cheer her up. Turns out Duke Albrandt filed a formal complaint against Thompson, and he got canned. That was awesome. And with all the goodbyes, the girl didn't realize she was running a little late for her meeting with the Duke. The guy didn't get what the big deal was, since she wasn't leaving forever. And her contract included vacation time anyway. The contract was seriously great, and not just because of the vacation. She needed to get Kazan ready to serve in the Duchy's Dragon Squad. Good thing is Grace and the dragon get along so well. But there was one thing in the contract that bothered Lydia. If the trainer thinks extra training is needed, they get a bonus for the work. But the guy didn't see what was weird about that, since the trainer understands the dragon's condition better than anyone else. So if Lydia spots any issues with Kazan's condition, she's obligated to report it, and she'll get paid extra for the information. It all sounded reasonable at the time, but now this conversation was stuck in her head, even though she was trying to stay positive. Either way, the contract was signed, and it was time to prove herself. Yeah, and the road to the Duchy was easy, interesting, and exciting. The perfect place to raise dragons, no matter how you slice it. She needed to calm down, but it was so hard to do, now that she was in a mini-paradise for dragon trainers. Only the escorts didn't share her enthusiasm, though Kazan recognized her, so she shouldn't have any problems. At that moment, the girl started to feel uneasy, because the other men were starting to look at her strangely. Lydia had no idea how she could have gotten on their bad side so quickly, but she definitely had something to think about. Although, she could guess it had something to do with wounded pride, since Kazan opened up and started listening to her, leaving the Duchy's head trainer out in the cold. Only now did she realize that becoming one of the team in this long-established group wouldn't be easy. But they had already arrived, and the girl was looking forward to meeting different dragons. But when the gates opened, her hopes crashed against the rocks of reality. Too bad there wasn't a single dragon there. There couldn't have been, not with Kazan spiraling out of control so fast. And to top it off, the head trainer immediately found something else to do and wasn't about to help Lydia settle in. He took off so fast, Lydia didn't even have time to shout. How could this happen? What did she do to tick off the universe? And these guys call themselves trainers? It's just sad at this point. Yeah, it's a super tough job, and you can't click with every dragon right away. But to bail out in fear like that? That's just weak. Lydia wasn't about to do that, so first thing, she decided to lead Kazan inside his pen. But the dragon started acting stubborn again. You couldn't deny how determined and picky he was. He's not doing it to be mean, just because he doesn't get people. So she explained to him that the guy wasn't mad at him at all. He'll be back soon, but for now, Kazan needs to head inside the house and wait for her there. It was their first assignment. The dragon had to sit and wait, and she was sure he could handle it. Lydia herself hurried off to confront the Duke, believing Kazan's condition was his fault. Albrandt hadn't seen her yet and was talking to his assistant. Turns out they've been having a ton of problems lately. Pascal pointed out that they wouldn't be easy to solve, especially after the title transfer. The worst part is that a lot of the handlers couldn't take the pressure and quit. Yeah, they were backed into a corner and had to take care of Julius Albrandt and his wife, but it hit the dukedom hard. That guy barged into the man's life when he was just a kid who'd lost his parents, and he couldn't put up a decent fight against his greedy schemes. Now, don't forget that every noble family had dragons, which means they also had personal handlers. In families that owned rare dragons, the handler's status skyrocketed. But they're not around now, and Albrandt needs to figure something out. The Duke's uncle figured the Albrandt's loyal trainers would eventually turn on him, so he just offed them. But maybe this new trainer the Duke brought in can turn things around. After all, Lydia was a pretty unique character. Pascal needed more intel to figure out his next move. The Duke didn't have much info, and his main thing was that Kazan seemed chill around her. But thinking about it, that's kinda wild. Pascal knew Kazan was super picky, and if he didn't like someone, he wouldn't give them the time of day for years. Meanwhile, a seriously ticked-off Lydia was heading for the Duke's office. Her entrance was epic. Door kicked open, screeching like a seagull in distress. She was burning with righteous anger, ready to roast this dude. Looks like this is going to be a loud conversation. She's here because she was hired to train Kazen, but something's already gone sideways. Lithia wasn't expecting, for example, that Kazen had pretty much lived alone since birth. But it is what it is, and she'll have to work with it. She needs to get the dragon used to other dragons and taking food from strangers. In that case, he needs to be moved in with the other dragons immediately. It's the only way Kazen will learn to interact with them, and if we keep him separate, we'll never see any progress. Albrandt found it hard to believe, but if Lithia's sure of what she's saying and willing to take full responsibility, then he's willing to meet her halfway. Of course, Lithia was ready for this, but first, she needed to make some small preparations. Specifically, while they're moving the dragon's enclosure, she'll use that time for basic dragon training and obedience drills. The guy figured Lithia should be able to handle it in a week, which pissed off Pascal. Albrandt didn't get the reaction, since Lithia herself said she'd be doing training while the new enclosure was being prepared, and he was hoping the girl wouldn't screw up her first assignment as a personal dragon trainer. That Duke's got away with words, all right. And the look on his face wasn't exactly promising sunshine and rainbows, but Lithia wasn't sweating it. She was sure she could turn things around real quick. The conversation wrapped up, and Lithia watched the other trainers straight up ice her out. No time to dwell on that, though, because it was evaluation day for the basic training results. Turning it into a public spectacle was kinda lame, but she was dying to prove that Duke wrong. A couple minutes later, Lithia was flying on Kazen to the training grounds to meet Albrandt and the other dragons. Now she had to see if Kazen would actually listen to her commands, with all those other dragons around. Of course, things didn't go smoothly. The second the other dragons saw Kazen, they freaked out and started acting up. Lithia knew she had to take control. First things first, she told the dragon to behave himself. It was tough for him to follow her orders, but he was giving it his best shot. But it still wasn't enough, and the girl asked him to scoot back a little. Reluctantly, Kazen did what Lithia asked. That was a huge step forward, and then she asked the dragon to lie down. The dragon liked that last command the best, while the other trainers watched in disbelief. Even the Duke couldn't believe his eyes, because up until now, he was the only one who could control his dragon's urges. Overall, everything went down exactly like Lithia said it would. It sounded like a compliment, but there was some kind of hidden meaning in it. What's more, Albrandt didn't look happy, but it should have been different, but it wasn't. But Lithia decided to think about it later. Right now, the Duke needed to accept the initial results. Besides, a dragon's a living thing, and you can't completely change its personality or predict its actions. You could feel the tension in the air between them, thick enough to cut with a knife. Still, the Duke put her in charge of training the beast handlers in his territory. Lithia was floored. There were tons of other handlers around, so why her? Except, in the Albrandt household, she was the only one. The people she'd seen were trainees who needed a mentor. That was a low blow. These rookies could screw things up big time and upset the dragons. The Duke had no right to keep that info from her, and she let him know it. Today's training could have been a disaster. The trainees could have hurt the dragons, and Kazen could have gone ballistic. How could he be so irresponsible? But nothing bad happened. Lithia kept Kazen in check. Otherwise, the whole mess would have landed on her. The guy left, and Lithia was trying to wrap her head around how a house like Albrandt didn't have a single personal handler. She wanted to tear the place apart. How could this happen? The Agrix dragon chose this noble family, and now he's got no personal handler? She gave off this vibe, like she came from some old noble line, but without the pedigree. And she wasn't far off. After saying that, the guy clammed up and started giving her the once-over. Truth is, he came to the shed to find Lithia and give her props for training Kazen so well. Now he's got a whole damn show, but he's gonna hold off on that now. What he is curious about, though, is whether Lithia remembers the terms of her contract. She remembered, but she didn't think the clause about extra work and bonuses would apply to this kind of thing. So, the question now is, does she think the team's training is good enough to start working with Kazen? The answer was obvious to both Albrandt and Lithia, which means the student's training can be considered part of the dragon's education. But Lithia was worried. Yeah, she'd get paid, but this was a bit much, even for her. Yeah, and His Grace was pissed, 'cause Kazen actually listened to her. Whatever. What's gonna happen is gonna happen. but we still gotta work. So the girl figured a house like Albrandt's had to have some special training techniques. She really wanted to check out those records. An awkward silence hung in the air. Then the Duke got curious about how well the girl knew his family. The question caught Lithia off guard, since she never really cared about rumors. She spent all her time training the former kingdom's dragons, so she didn't give a damn about noble family's business. So, the Duke decided to start his story from way back. Turns out, his family lived for 100 years without an Agrix dragon, until one showed up for him not long ago. And before that, there wasn't a legitimate heir in the family, and that kicked off a power struggle. You can probably guess what fake heirs did with their personal trainers. Lithia had a hunch, which just made her more determined to train Kazen and teach her students. But while she's doing that, the dragon enclosure move is on hold, which makes things easier. So, day 1 of training the apprentices is here, but Lithia could feel they didn't like her. But the girl forced a smile and introduced herself, announcing she's the personal trainer for House Albrandt from now on, and mentor to the assistants. You could see the disapproval, confusion, and distrust all over the guys' faces. Pascal totally got where the assistants were coming from, but they each needed to remember the Duke personally chose Lithia. That kind of hype didn't help her, and neither did telling everyone to just relax and be themselves. Not in this situation. Some of the guys were surprised, since they'd never seen her before. Others were wary, since they'd had the honor of escorting her here. And that was a pretty normal reaction to changes in news like this. Yeah, she's their teacher now, but she's new, doesn't know anything about the duchy's dragons, so she respects every assistant who's been taking care of the dragons. She was ready to share her knowledge with them, and in return, she needed info about the duchy's dragons and the Agrix dragons. One of the assistants jumped right into the argument, asking what would happen if some clumsy intern pissed off the Agrix dragon. What's worse, Kazen almost fried one assistant for bringing the wrong food, and nearly clawed another to shreds just because he was in a bad mood. They can't even get near him. Lithia knew it was a deliberate jab, but she figured that since everyone here was supposed to be working with dragons, it was in their best interest to share information. But the guy saw things differently. He thought nobody here wanted to end up as Dragon Chow, courtesy of the Duke's precious pet. And the redhead thought that since they didn't have a license, they shouldn't even bother trying. Lithia hated that kind of attitude. For her, dragons were everything, and she wanted to believe everyone there loved them, license or no license. Besides, she wasn't aiming to be the big boss. She wanted to work side by side with people who shared her passion for dragons. That's why she wasn't ashamed to ask her colleagues for help. In that moment, she remembered the Duke, who was convinced that if she were any less sharp, she would have already met the same fate as the previous trainers. Right then, she realized clearly, Albrandt was threatening her, and he wasn't even trying to hide it. After that, he turned around and left, promising decent pay for her work. But she and the interns had to prove their worth. Or else they were toast, you could read between the lines. All right, the meeting's over, and time to feed the dragons. Lithia instantly knew the intern was hinting she should do it herself. How badly this dude underestimated her, and he even smiled sweetly while saying nasty stuff. But Lithia wasn't about to back down, and smiled sweetly back, hoping he was just talking about feeding. And she was right. If that's all it was, then the assistant could go about his business. She'd handle it herself. After watching the guy's reaction, she came to a few conclusions. Now she needed to get to work. They weren't the first to try and demean her. They're nowhere near Thompson and Asher's level. They're gonna regret dumping dragon feeding on her. While feeding one of the dragons, she noticed he wasn't finishing his food, and his scales weren't as shiny anymore. Lilia was furious with the trainees right now. Nobody messes with the dragons like that. She was already figuring out how to beat some respect and love for these creatures into those careless workers. The conspirators had no clue, and thought that since she was from the capital, she'd be running back there any day now. Exactly 1 week had passed since that day, and one of the trainees went to the dragon, but it wouldn't listen to him anymore. Bruce outsmarted himself, thinking Lilia would get into trouble, but they all did, because the dragons weren't taking orders from them anymore. The guy didn't understand what was happening. Just a few days ago, the dragons were peaceful, and now this. Just then, Lilia came into the pen. She didn't get what was going on, since it was training time, but everyone was just standing around doing nothing. The guys were already stuttering and didn't know what to tell her. But since no one was saying anything, She was just gonna leave and get the dragon's lunch ready. Bruce noticed things were shifting in the dragon pen at that moment. The second Lithia stepped inside, all the dragons instantly calmed down. Bruce immediately wanted to talk to her. But figures, Lithia was busy. On top of that, she had to feed and train 30 dragons, plus Kazan. Bruce realized he'd really screwed up and decided to be the first to apologize for his low-down behavior. But nobody was buying his apology because his words rang hollow. Still, she was grateful to the guy for the lesson he'd inadvertently taught her. Up until now, all the trainees had been dumping all their work on her. But as soon as things got a little rough, they started apologizing. That's not how things work. Switching tactics, 2 of the trainees decided to lend Lithia a hand with her chores. But that tactic didn't work either. She wasn't about to solve their problems for them. She figured they made their own bed. Now they can lie in it. And she didn't care what happened to them. Lithia was cooking food for the dragons, knowing full well that the guys would come running to her the second trouble started. They tried to set her up with the feeding, but they didn't know the trainer's supposed to give half the food, and the student gives the other half during training, so the dragons start listening to them. But that was their big mistake, and they were about to learn that the hard way. With most of the work done, she finally had some time for Kazan, who was sleeping peacefully in his enclosure. To relax a bit, Lydia decided to lie down next to him, because it was the only place where she could catch a break without being bothered. She had about an hour to cuddle with Kazan. She felt so warm, peaceful, and happy right now. But Lydia wasn't the only one who wanted to check on Kazan. Albrant did too. The dragon wasn't about to let him get close though, making it clear he better back off. He even started growling, and the guy thought the dragon was getting sick. But it was all because Lithia was sleeping soundly under his wing, and he was protecting her peace from everyone. The Duke wasn't expecting things to go down like this. He couldn't figure out why she was sleeping next to his favorite dragon. Just then, he remembered Pascal's report, which said that the assistants weren't listening to Lithia, and she was doing all the work herself. The Duke didn't understand why his assistant was only telling him this now. Pascal figured the girl saw it as an internal matter and wanted to handle it herself, even though she could have used her position to lighten her load. Amazing and strange girl. The Duke looked at her and couldn't figure her out. Kazan growled as a warning. Albrant knew he'd better not wake Lithia and just watch her, but he wasn't planning on doing that for long, since Lithia was responsible for Kazan, and if she passed out from exhaustion, it would become his personal problem. The Duke split, but she still couldn't catch a break. Assistants were running around, yelling, calling for her, which pissed off both her and Kazan. One of the assistants came running in, practically in tears, saying they were in deep trouble. Turns out, all the riding dragons had bolted. The second the assistants opened the pen, all the dragons took off, and nobody could catch them to bring them back. Lithia was furious. She hated incompetent people who just screwed things up for everyone else, and then someone else had to clean up their mess. The guy was already crying, trying to excuse himself by saying the alpha led the whole herd away. The guys tried to reason with the dragons, but they just ignored them. She should have just stayed out of it, but her conscience wouldn't let her. Yeah, they were just riding dragons, but even they could cause a ton of problems if they weren't stopped fast. So, she decided to take advantage of Kazan's eagerness to prove his loyalty and asked the assistant to open the riding dragon's pen gate. Lithia was on a mission to bring all the dragons back home. So, she was flying after the runner dragons, which kinda looked like regular horses, if you squinted. The girl was trying to think like a runner dragon, trying to figure out where they'd bolt to. Since no one was in sight, she asked Kazan to fly higher for a better view. After a while, they spotted the whole herd down below, making a beeline for the field. They looked happy and pumped. But it was time to end the fun and games, so Lithia blew a special whistle, catching the leader's attention. And as soon as the herd slowed down, Lithia and Kazan swooped down too, blocking the dragon's path. Okay, party's over, time to head back. Except the dragons didn't see it that way. And if Lithia had come here without Kazan, she'd be freaking out right now. Agrix the dragon made it crystal clear that the steeds better listen to his personal trainer. Meanwhile, the assistants were freaking out in the steed pen, not believing they'd ever get them home. The guys knew they were in deep trouble, but they didn't have a clue how to fix things. Even if they rested up and rode after the dragons, there was no way they could force those pets to follow them home. They had to remember the Duke could demand compensation for the lost dragons, and they were broke, so they had to try and get the steeds back. Just then, another trainee ran into the hangar, shouting that all the dragon steeds were coming home. Lithia was riding the leader, and when she was just a few yards from the gate, she asked them to open the training field. None of the assistants could believe their eyes, but the girl had brought the lost dragons back. Lithia dismounted the dragon, but didn't rush to start talking to her subordinates. She couldn't understand how professional trainer assistants could let a whole herd of dragons escape. What were they even doing? What were they thinking? Or were they even thinking at all? She was almost curious what kind of lame excuses the trainees would come up with. Bruce decided to apologize for everyone. He even got down on his knees in front of Lithia, totally owning up to his screw-up. That was enough. She didn't want beef with all of them. She wanted to work side by side with them. After all, she'd said from the start that she needed every one of them. She respected each of them because their work was invaluable, but she demanded the same respect in return. This time, Bruce got the message and shook Lithia's hand. Just then, Albrant came to the training field, wondering what the heck was going on. But he'd already gotten the report, and the guy didn't think a mass horse escape was no big deal. Lithia totally understood the Duke's bad mood, but figured since the horses were back, and their leader probably brought some wild buddies with him, it wasn't the end of the world. So she thought it was a perfect opportunity to let the whole thing slide. The Duke saw it the other way. He didn't think it was right to ignore the assistant's screw-up. Still, Lithia kept defending her co-workers, because firing them would just make the problem even worse. And replacing them would be a total nightmare, since they know the Duchy's dragons better than anyone. Rohannes wasn't expecting her to go so hard defending guys who clearly weren't cutting it. Even so, he decided to meet her halfway. Since the situation was fixed, he wasn't going to come down too hard on the guys. He'd dock their pay for a year, and if they couldn't prove they were useful to the Duchy in that time, they'd be canned. It was a pretty light sentence, and every intern was grateful to the Duke. That's when Bruce realized they'd basically been let off easy, since Albrant could replace any of them in a heartbeat, with his money and influence. If Lithia hadn't gone to bat for them, things would have turned out real bad for the interns. With that, the investigation was over. Lithia was wiped, so the Duke found her conked out under his dragon's wing. The guy was clueless why she was crashing here again, especially since the dragon was so sure she'd fallen for his charm. Rohannes just wasn't buying it. What's more, he figured the dragon was getting way too comfortable, and she needed a change of scenery. Nobody wanted Lithia getting sick and never coming back. Kazan put up a fight, but the guy wasn't asking for his opinion anymore. He carried her, thinking that when someone's back is against the wall, their true colors come out. Everything happening in the Duchy was planned. The key was figuring out what kind of person Lydia was, because being talented and being reliable are two different things. Now a lot made sense, and Albrant's main priority was getting her treatment, because he'd ordered the servants to treat her according to her status as the Duchy's only personal dragon trainer. After all, she not only brought back the dragons that had escaped, but she also brought several wild ones with her, and Kazan listens to her. All doubts about her vanished, and the question became, how could she have stayed in the shadows of other trainers until now? Why was she clinging to him? He probably thought she wasn't just exhausted, but also really shaken up by everything that happened. Morning came, and Lithia woke up in a completely unfamiliar place. It was a beautifully decorated room in the Duke's main residence. But the fear and confusion quickly faded, and Lithia, like some character in a cheesy novel, started saying dumb things. Seriously, she needed to figure out where she was. Last thing she remembered was falling asleep in the dragon's enclosure. Just then, the butler came into the room and brought in tons of food, saying the Duke wanted her to rest today. It was only now dawning on the lady that she'd been changed, put to bed, and now they were going to feed her well and force her to relax. It felt wrong, and she started worrying about Kazan. But the Duke showed up, saying he'd taken care of her dragon himself. The guy seemed weird to her, even suggesting they eat together. Honestly, she thought she was too embarrassed to even swallow, but her appetite was surprisingly strong. Rohannes didn't seem to notice her discomfort. He was just wondering if sleeping next to Kazan was actually safe. She knew she probably shouldn't have, but his scales were just so warm, she couldn't resist. That was an unexpected explanation, and the guy told her not to do that again. Besides, training Kazan is just an excuse. He's been looking for a permanent personal handler for the Duchy the whole time. And he was curious if Lydia really thought Agrix-type dragons actually needed to live in groups. Lydia really did think so. Socialization is important, just like the ability to live in groups, which surprised the guy. It's because Kazan isn't a wild dragon, he lives among people. If he starts hurting them, there's only one solution, and the Duke won't like it. Namely, if that happens, the dragon will have to be put to sleep. If Albrecht doesn't want that, he needs to do things her way. Even if Rohannes refuses, what's he gonna do against a direct order from the royal family? You gotta understand, a dragon called the Living Volcano could cause some serious problems, and the Duke can't just ignore that. Lithia knew she was being harsh, but the human world just isn't made for dragons. The fact that there haven't been any incidents so far just shows how much the Duke cares. That's why she, as a contracted dragon handler, will give it her all for Kazan. So Rohannes needs to seriously consider her offer. This was not the breakfast conversation Albrecht was expecting. Definitely not. After that awkward moment, Lithia wanted to know how long her personal leave would last. She was only counting on 1 week, not a day more. And Lithia thought that was too much. She wasn't used to relaxing, and Kazan needed her attention. There's no need to worry about that. The Duke himself is taking care of it. After that, the young dudes split, leaving Lithia all alone, not knowing what to do next. She could tell the guy genuinely cared about the dragon, but every time they started talking, they'd smoothly dodge the main point. It was a little frustrating, but right now, she just wanted to chill and have some fun. 3 days later, the girl bumped into the guy in the hallway of his mansion, near the library. Judging by the look on his face, something weird was going on with him. Looks like her vacation's gonna get cut short. Albrecht wasn't giving an inch, not showing any weakness, and figured the girl needed to keep relaxing. He wasn't about to assign work to someone who hadn't fully recovered their own strength. If that's how it was, she was planning to keep relaxing, but something was bugging her, 'cause the Duke looked sick. Another 2 days slowly went by. Now Lithia was sunbathing, but the assistants couldn't handle things without her and were begging for help. Turns out they were having some issues with the dragons. Okay, now this is getting interesting. The guys followed her feeding schedules and had no issues, but Kazan was screaming his head off every night. So some of the more sensitive dragons got spooked by the screaming and suffered some easily treatable setbacks. The assistant was freaking out and didn't know what to do. Rohannes said he could handle his own dragon, but Kazan just kept screaming and wouldn't calm down. This was a problem. Lithia was sure she had everything under control, and it sucked to realize she was wrong. So she and the assistant quickly saddled up a riding dragon and took off to sort out the situation. A few minutes later, she arrived at Kazan's place and found the Duke completely wiped out. But that didn't matter, because Kazan ran up to her and, like always, licked her head. She didn't come just for cuddles. No self-respecting dragon trainer stands by when their dragons are acting up. Honestly, it was all pretty obvious to her. Kazan and Albrecht were too much alike, like two sides of the same coin. In that moment, she also realized the dragon was ticked off at her for not visiting sooner, and that he missed her. That's when it hit her. The Duke never intended to accept anyone but Kazan and himself from the start. Time marched on, and Lithia got down to business. She pondered how the Duke had acted more than honorably. After all, he'd raised Kazan for over a decade, and now he was listening to someone else more than him. No wonder she constantly saw distrust in his eyes. It must sting and feel like a betrayal to him. She'd once read in a book that people chosen by dragons become deeply attached and form a special bond, and it seemed like that had happened with her and Kazan. And it was partly her fault. She hadn't considered that the dragon might act this way. Things got awkward between them that day. The Duke let her finish her vacation, since he couldn't personally calm Kazan down. Now, more than ever, Lithia understood she couldn't afford to screw this up. The personal trainer should have corrected some of the dragon's behavioral issues back when he was a kid, but no one ever told Albrecht or the dragon about it. And she's got to bathe the dragon today. A lake would be perfect right now. Just toss the dragon in, problem solved. Seeing the girl was bummed, Kazan tried to cheer her up, but she just told him to back off. But the dragon was determined to wear her down, screeching, writhing around, acting like a spoiled brat. Thing is, the whistle snapped Kazan out of it. If he wanted affection, he could go to his grace. Lithia wasn't gonna pet him. Kazan was hurt, but Lithia was unyielding, even though she desperately wanted to hug him too. It was the right call. The dragon and his master couldn't risk their fragile bond because of her. Meanwhile, Albrecht showed up at the park too, and he totally wasn't expecting a dragon to jump him out of nowhere. He knocked his owner to the ground and started licking his face all over. Lithia caught them in the middle of this boring activity, hoping the Duke hadn't changed his mind about fixing the dragon's behavior. Albrant wasn't backing down, but he didn't think you could fix something like that overnight. He stared into Kazen's eyes, confused why his dragon was so happy. Just yesterday, he wouldn't listen, kept calling for Lithia and crying. But now, he felt like a little kid again, like his little dragon had come back, and they were together like before. The Duke could feel Kazen's joy, the joy of seeing him. Lithia noticed it too, and decided to leave them alone and work with her assistants herself. But before she could even take a step, the Duke stopped her and apologized. The guy knew he'd messed up. It was just, Kazen had never cried for anyone before, and it hurt him to hear it and see it. Lithia understood everything, and since she was Kazen's personal handler, fixing stuff like this was her job, so no harm done. With that, she left, knowing she'd done a good job. Lithia could finally breathe, even if just for a little bit. Albrant watched her straight back as he hugged Kazen, realizing they finally had a personal handler. Meanwhile, back in the other paddocks, things were buzzing. The assistants were cleaning up the enclosures, while the dragons got their exercise in the field. That was good news, but the girl had other things on her mind. Training starts tomorrow, but today she wanted to check on the dragon's condition. Overall, things seemed all right. The dragons were taking turns roaming around, except Lord Bascal always walked his pet himself. Rumor had it that Duke Albrant personally found and delivered that dragon to his aide, who was also his childhood friend. Suddenly, Lithia heard strange noises. One of the dragons was getting aggressive. The trainees freaked out when she reached her hand toward the dragon, but she was fine. All she wanted to know was who was responsible for that dragon. She didn't have to call the trainee twice. She needed to figure out if anything unusual had happened to this dragon recently. Louis was always super sensitive and reacted strongly to everything around him. And that's all because this dragon's already switched owners once before. It happened right when the dukedom was caught in a serious power struggle. Bruce didn't know the details either, probably why he's still alive, but he heard that Louis's trainer and owner both died back then. A lot about the dragon's behavior makes sense now, since he instinctively understood that his old master wasn't coming back. The assistants were hurting to see Louis suffer too, so they'd be thrilled if Lithia could help him accept a new owner. Good question. Lithia couldn't say for sure. First things first, she needed to check out Lady Durna, Louis's owner. That woman was the only alchemist in the Albrant house. The girl decided to go to the Duke with this issue. Gotta start somewhere, right? Besides, Albrant needs to know that all his dragons have problems, but Louis is the most urgent case of them all. And there was a high chance that he could cause a situation pretty soon. Sadly, the guy kinda suspected something like that himself, since he was always surrounded by just assistants, but they'd all managed to stay out of trouble for so long. And Lithia was sure all the trainees would make great handlers. She believed it was totally doable to certify them all within a year, especially since they managed to raise dragons in such bare-bones conditions. Right then, Lithia realized she should have been persuading the Duke, not turning the conversation into a battle of wills. Lucky for her, the Duke decided not to interfere, figuring if Lithia was so confident, she could pull off the impossible. And that's because she knows better than anyone else here how things should be done. He trusted her, even when it came to the Kazan situation. Having received the Duke's orders, Lithia headed to Lady Durna's lab, finding her completely absorbed in her research. If the woman wasn't willing to cooperate, she wouldn't go against the Duke's written orders. After a little while, she found the right room and knocked on the door. The door took forever to open, but finally it did, and this girl appeared in the doorway. Durna was a beautiful brunette, but she didn't get why Lithia was pulling her away from work. The girls introduced themselves, and then Lithia handed the alchemist the Duke's orders. Grudgingly, Durna let Lithia into her office, and that's when Lithia got a surprise. A total disaster zone, not even a place to sit. They managed to clear off a spot for Lithia to sit, and then she got to the main topic, Louis the Dragon. At that moment, Durna's expression totally changed. Lithia chalked it up to worry about her pet and offered a training course to improve his condition, adding that it would be great if Durna participated too. Suddenly, Lithia felt a little suspicious and asked how many times a week the girl visited her dragon, and if she even cared about Louis at all. Right now, it was crucial for Lithia to figure out if the dragon, Dern, meant anything to her. When she didn't get an answer, The trainer suggested the girl either give the dragon to someone else or actually start training him. That's when the alchemist snapped, yelling that she wouldn't give her dragon to anyone. Now it was Lydia's turn to be quiet. She'd often met owners who screamed they'd never give up their pet, but treated them like garbage. Here we go again. The alchemist was stubbornly defending her right to own Lewis, but she wasn't taking care of him at all. Now she had to make a call. If she wanted to change things, she had to participate in the training. If not, the dragon would be better off with someone else. The girl's face fell. She explained that she'd tried to connect with Lewis, but he wouldn't open up to her. And then there was an incident. Lewis inflicted a wound that could have been fatal. Lucky it wasn't, but the scar remains. Lydia definitely wasn't expecting that kind of twist. The trainer quickly composed herself and once again suggested the dragon have a new owner, but her companion refused yet again. Back in the day, Lewis was the dragon of Derna's father, and she really wanted to be friends with the dragon. But now she just remembers how he hurt her and can't bring herself to get close. Meanwhile, Kazan and Albrandt were having a pretty good time hanging out. Just then, Lethia came up to them with a report. Things were complicated, so she needed some extra artifacts. Lewis is the cause for now, but from her tone, the Duke could tell this was just the tip of the iceberg. And if these artifacts are only needed for one dragon now, it's only a matter of time before others need them too. Suddenly, the conversation took a turn. The Duke admitted he knew about Derna's injury, which is why he canned the old handler. But it wasn't just a simple firing. To get it, you gotta remember the Derno family's been working for the Albrandts for years. And all that time, they were into alchemy, meaning they passed down secret knowledge to their heirs. Now Lithia's gotta figure out what motivated those handlers who were trying to get close to Louis. That's right, every single one of them was sent by the Duke's enemies, who wanted to wipe out all the alchemists here. When the attack happened, Albrandt explained everything to Derna, but she didn't hear him. She was too freaked out by the attack itself. And if anyone else could have understood the alchemist, it definitely wasn't Lithia. On the other hand, she felt bad for Derna, because she was blaming herself for everything, instead of the coach who stirred up this whole mess. Plus, a dragon who's lost its master can't just forget them and accept someone else so easily. She's got a wall up around her heart now, and it's hard to tell how strong it is. Derna felt it too. She felt sorry for the dragon, especially when it cried. It hurt her too. That's why she didn't want to give the dragon away, because she'd lost someone close too. They were the same. But Derna couldn't get her feelings across to Lewis. Now they needed to find a way to fix everything. Kazan and Albrandt watched Lithia freaking out, but they didn't know how to help her. They decided, as a group, that Kazan should give her a hug to cheer her up. Lithia perked right up. She realized she'd made cute Kazan worry. That kind of support was medicine for the handler, and the dragon was feeling pretty good about himself. But then she suddenly switched from sweet to furious and ordered Kazan to go get hugs from the Duke. She wasn't doing it on a whim, but because she was a professional. Yeah, she loved dragons, but that shouldn't mess with her job. Plus, if you get too attached to a dragon, it's gonna hurt like hell to let them go after training. The Duke hadn't thought about it that way. So, blushing, he allowed Lithia to give Kazan a little more TLC than the other dragons. Well, that was unexpected, especially coming from Albrandt. But the guy didn't back down, even though Lithia was giving him a serious death glare. If the Duke's cool with it, who is she to deny herself a little fun? Besides, Kazan's been looking down in the dumps lately. Just now, she could see the dragon was bummed out. All it took was a little warmth in her voice, and the dragon just lit up with joy. Lithia praised him for being patient and waiting, and promised him a tasty treat as a reward. Besides, the Duke himself gave her the green light, and she wasn't about to pass up an opportunity like that. And she definitely didn't want to get on the Duke's bad side for no reason. After her walk with Kazan, Lithia went to check on Louis. The dragon was in rough shape. Even the calming incense wasn't doing much for him. Since that wasn't working, Lithia asked Russell to make the door to the enclosure transparent. After a few simple adjustments, Lithia could see Louis clearly. That's when she had a clever idea. Set up a table and chair near the enclosure so she could spend more time with the dragon. She was only planning on giving Kazan her attention when needed. Otherwise, all her time was going to Louis. Up until today, Russell had been handling Louis. The dragon was holding back, not attacking the guy, but you could tell he didn't exactly like him. Russell left, and Lithia knew Louis was not happy about the situation, But he needed to understand that shutting everyone out wasn't the answer. Time passed, and it was time to walk Kazan, who immediately smelled the other dragon on Lithia and got a little ticked off. Still, his anger wasn't that bad, and he wasn't showing aggression, so that meant he could get used to other dragons eventually. 2 weeks went by like that. Lithia brought Lewis food in the morning, Russell in the evening. The rest of the time, the girl just sat by Lewis's enclosure, doing nothing, and it helped close the distance between them. He used to lie in the corner, but now the dragon's reaching his nose out to sniff her. Kazan snapped the girl out of her thoughts. It seemed like he was tired of walking. But then she realized the dragon had picked her a bouquet of daisies, and she got as happy as a kid. If she hadn't known he was a freaking Agrix dragon that everyone's scared of, there's no way she would have believed it. Little by little, she studied this type of dragon through Kazan. These days, his habits often reminded her of a spoiled brat. This idea gave Lithia an idea for an experiment. She decided to bring Durna to Lewis. The handler understood the alchemist's fear, but she needed to test an idea. Plus, she'd be right there the whole time, so nothing bad would happen. And so the girl stood near the dragon. She was scared out of her mind, but she found the strength to say hello. Lewis didn't attack, but he looked extremely wary, and the dragon's patience was about to snap. Lithia's intuition was right. Lewis growled, showing that a peaceful conversation wasn't gonna happen. And then Lewis lunged at the bars, and at that moment, Lithia realized Lewis wanted to off Durna. Wait a sec. The dragon didn't want to off his owner. He wanted to off Lithia. This discovery was a real kick in the teeth for the trainer. Something had to be done, and Lithia came up with the idea to have Durna shove her, like she was trying to kick her out. This was so the girl could hide, while the alchemist could talk to her dragon nice and easy. The main character knew her new friend was scared, but it was necessary to build a relationship with the dragon. Durna tried to do what Lithia asked, but it looked totally ridiculous. No surprise Lithia asked her to try again. Louise had no clue what was going on. The girl couldn't be afraid of hurting the trainer. The main thing was for the dragon to believe the owner was attacking the trainer. Gathering all her strength and will, the girl gave Lithia a pretty solid shove. This time, the main character almost actually fell. That was exactly what they needed, and the trainer mouthed words of encouragement to the girl. The show went on, and Lithia said she'd step out, but if Dern needed anything, she shouldn't hesitate to call her. The animal handler hid, and the alchemist started watching her dragon, who wasn't showing any aggression anymore. Now, she was supposed to say some kind words to her dragon in a calm, gentle voice, but she was too scared. And the fear was stronger than any other feeling, so she couldn't say anything and just ran away from the dragon. She was running away again, leaving Lewis alone again, not thinking about his feelings at all. The girl knew she'd messed up big time, so she was really beating herself up about it back in her office. Lithia, meanwhile, was trying to calm her down, trying to get her to understand that it wasn't the alchemist's fault. Ultimately, neither Lewis nor the girl are to blame for their behavior. The real culprit is hundreds of miles away. Besides, Dern needs to realize that Lewis doesn't hate her. Yeah, he was aggressive, but he had his reasons. But this time, Lithia was the target of his aggression. And that was the crazy thing, because up until Durna showed up next to Lithia, Louis was following the trainer's orders to the letter. But Durna remembered that Louis always blew off her commands, and that was the whole problem. The dragon didn't see Durna as his master. He had his reasons, his own justification, but she hadn't exactly been trying to change that. To actually get somewhere with this, she needed to keep doing what she was doing. Mom also wasn't sure the alchemist could actually connect with the dragon, being the only thing left of her dad. Lithia didn't have a clear answer either, or any real guarantee this would work. But if Durna wasn't backing down, Lithia would give it everything she had to help her out. The alchemist knew she still had a long way to go, but she was asking the trainer to meet her halfway and lend a hand. Because she wasn't just gonna quit, she wasn't willing to give up on Louis. Meanwhile, Lewis was dwelling on the fact that his new master was a girl, a fragile thing, the offspring of his former master. Back in those dark days, his former master vanished, and the dragons he was close to were dying, choking on their own blood. Back then, this girl couldn't protect anyone. Now, things were starting to shift dramatically. She was still scared, but she was approaching his enclosure. She was even trying to bark orders at him with that bossy tone. And now, it was getting harder and harder to disobey her commands. For a second there, Lewis almost thought he was looking at her father. Not a little girl. Lewis knew damn well his master was dead, and that's why hearing those familiar inflections in her voice was so unsettling. Lithia and Kaizen were watching all this from the sidelines, and the handler figured she needed to step in and teach Lewis a little lesson. Just then, Duran turned around and saw Lithia entering the room. But the girl didn't come to the meeting alone. She brought Kaizen with her. Duran was seeing the Duke's personal dragon up close for the first time ever. You gotta give it to the dragon. He definitely knew how to make an entrance just by showing up. And unlike Lewis, he was being super friendly with the stranger. He even let her pet him, which totally pissed off his buddy. Duran got freaked out. But Lithia told her not to stop and to keep petting Kaizen. It was a clear message, meant for Lewis to understand that if she didn't play ball, the person who only had eyes for her might just move on to another dragon. And let's be real, that was the honest truth. A decision that had been brewing for a while now. If Lewis doesn't change her attitude, even if Duran has second thoughts, Lithia's still gonna do what she has to do. Honestly, she's playing a dangerous game right now. Kaizen won't forget this kind of disrespect. Louise needs to learn her place in the non-dragon pecking order and not get sassy with the top dog. Looks like she finally figured out who's in charge around here. Louise even broke down crying from all the stress, and Durna didn't want to leave her, but Lithia made the girl go. Once they were out of the room, Lithia asked if the alchemist was okay. She was fine, since she'd chugged a courage potion earlier. All in all, she did a killer job today, and now she can visit Louise's pen once a week. And the girl doesn't need to sweat the dragon's health, 'cause Lithia will personally keep an eye on everything. Meanwhile, a satisfied Kaizen strolled back to the dragon trainer. Seeing how carefully Lithia was treating this massive dragon, Durna asked her to look after Louise too. The alchemist doesn't need to worry about that at all. Now it's the dragon's turn to sweat. And just like that, a whole week flew by. Everything was going smoothly. But then Durna came running, looking totally freaked out about Lithia. She was super worried about her dragon. Like, was she eating okay? Getting enough exercise? Just generally, how was she doing? There were way too many questions, so Lithia figured it'd be easier to just show the results, which honestly, she wasn't completely sure about. Durna was seriously stressed, because if this method didn't work, who knew what would happen next? But the second the dragon saw her owner, she bolted over and leaned her head against the barrier. She really didn't want to roar anymore. She was crying and begging to go to her mommy. Durna didn't get what was up with her dragon, but Lithia told her to say something sweet and kind to Louis. But before she could even get a word out, the dragon showed submission, recognizing her as her owner. It was all good. Lithia just made Louis understand that the only person who truly loved her was Durna. Truth is, the trainer's method was pretty intense, and now it's up to the alchemist to build a trusting relationship with the dragon. The girl was incredibly grateful to Lithia for all her hard work. She was also proud of herself for acing her first crisis at this new job. Just then, she noticed Bruce and a few of his assistants approaching her. Each of the assistants wanted to express their admiration for Lithia's work. That's when she remembered she'd been so busy she'd forgotten about the deal with the Duke, and she could really use Bruce's help right now. He immediately figured that she was probably going to bring up certification. That was exactly it. Lithia wanted to help the interns get their official trainer licenses. Because every intern here has the experience and skills to be a fully qualified trainer, the only thing they're missing is the certificate. And once everyone has a certificate, the difference between interns and full trainers will disappear, at least in how they're treated. Besides, if these guys don't get certified, they'll all be kicked out of the duchy, and Bruce knew that was probably going to happen. The guy appreciated Lithia's offer, but thought it'd be way too much for him to handle. Lithia was trying to figure out why he felt that way. Thing is, he didn't have a wife or kids. He had enough cash, and science was never his strong suit. But there was a lot at stake. The Duke doesn't make empty promises. Why couldn't Bruce get that? Maybe he did get it, but his experience working there, like the other assistants, was just too specialized. Did all the interns think the same way? Turns out they did. And that was a problem that was going to make life a whole lot harder for everyone. But Lithia wasn't one to back down, and she was determined to make sure all the assistants got certified and kept working there. She knew how much effort everyone put into taking care of the dragons in the duchy, so she was ready to help them all get that piece of paper. The girl pleaded with Bruce as best she could, not realizing the issue was something else entirely. Let's be real, everyone wanted that certification, but Lithia was swamped, so they didn't bother asking for her help. I mean, every day she's checking up on every dragon, correcting Louis's behavior, and even walking Kazan. Everyone respected her because she managed to do what they couldn't: get things moving in the duchy. Lithia didn't expect to be so valued here. She wasn't doing anything special, just helping dragons and their owners. Besides, she was happy, and she didn't want to lose the people who worked here. On top of that, if they all got canned, she'd be worked to death for sure. In the end, they understood each other. Lithia agreed to train assistants 3 evenings a week. Bruce and Lithia sealed the deal with a handshake. Evening came, and Dirna walked the castle halls, feeling incredibly happy. Before today, she'd often thought about giving up on Louis and ending the struggle for both of them. Truth be told, she was totally burned out from the dragon's mistrust and aggression. Even now, Louis still spooked her a little. She remembered that bloody incident way too well. But now she could pet the dragon on the nose, and that was a huge win. Just then, she spotted the Duke in the hallway. This meeting wasn't accidental. She was bringing him what he'd asked her to prep earlier. Albrant noticed Dirna's joy. She couldn't hide it. Lithia really came through. The Duke didn't doubt it for a second. He'd landed himself one hell of a handler. At that moment, Dirna followed the man's gaze and saw Lithia giving a lesson to her assistants. What's more, she'd promised to train the newbies in exchange for keeping an eye on Louis. This time, the Duke knew he'd struck gold and brought it back to the duchy. That was an interesting chat, but Dirna took a closer look at Albrant, realizing he still wasn't sleeping well. That was definitely out of line, and he wasn't about to admit his weakness or talk about it. But then he stopped himself. Yeah, the meds barely worked, and he could only really crash out next to Kazan. It was a problem. Dirna totally got it, but she had no idea how to help Albrant. Meanwhile, Lithia went to feed Kazan and saw her precious employer sprawled out next to the dragon, fast asleep. He looked so sweet and vulnerable like that. It was hard not to reach out and touch his handsome face. It would be perfect if this guy wasn't such a hard ass all the time. Nope. Sitting here staring was too much. Time to wake up Sleeping Beauty. That was a seriously bad call. If it wasn't for Kazan, she'd be a goner right now. Even so, the Duke's blade nicked her neck. Now she had to figure out who was to blame and what to do next. Even though Lithia was freaked out, she apologized to the Duke first. After all, she was the one who came up to him while he was sleeping and scared him. That's when Albrant noticed she was hurt. He knew he was responsible and needed to get a healer to check her out. But she didn't want to see a doctor, figuring it would heal before the wedding. But looking at him, she realized he was really worried. Besides, he seemed totally out of it, so she tried to bring him back to the present. Slowly, the guy started to come around, realizing he was home, with Kaze and Lithia. Clearly, Albrant remembered something from his not-so-easy past. He was way too pale. It was like Lydia saw something she wasn't supposed to, and while she was awkwardly looking away, Albrant scooped her up and carried her to the healer. More than anything, Lithia wanted him to put her down. The bleeding had stopped, and this was totally unnecessary. Nobody was listening to her, though. All that mattered was patching her up quick so she wouldn't scar. Even if they didn't go to the priest, they were still going to treat that wound. That was an order, no arguments, but Lithia fought back, saying she needed to feed Kazan first, which earned her a nasty growl. The Duke started to cave, realizing no matter how hard he pushed, Lithia wasn't going to the healer. Fine, then he was willing to talk about whatever she wanted. Lithia wasn't about to talk about the injury, but she wasn't about to be carried either. As much as he hated it, he gave in, and now they were back at the castle, where the butler greeted them. This worked out perfectly for Albrant, so he told the servant to fetch a priest to heal Lithia's wound. The butler was freaked out. He didn't know what happened and was really worried about the girl. Nobody said anything to that, and Albrant even ordered the handler to be well fed. Lithia wasn't expecting to be taken care of like a princess. But besides the food and treatment, the Duke asked the butler to give Lithia something. Turns out, Kazina was fed, and Louis was being looked after by her former trainer, so she could eat in peace and not worry. She figured the Duke was apologizing this way, but it felt a little too over the top. She thought the guy would quickly forget about it, but this time she was clearly wrong. She didn't think Albrant needed to sweat it so much. The guy was expecting her to grill him about why he slept with a dragon, but she didn't. But Lithia just laughed. Some might think she's weird, but she totally got why the Duke would sleep on his dragon's scales. That wasn't the answer he expected, but the reason he slept next to the dragon wasn't about its scales at all. It was something else entirely. He still couldn't fully trust Lithia. The scars left by other trainers cut way too deep. So, in the moment, drawing his blade, then feeding and healing her, seemed like the right call. But why was his heart racing like this now? A new day dawned, and Lithia now understood how tough it was to train other people. They needed more resources on riding dragons, and honestly, her assistants were still clueless about so much. She could hit the library, but there was no guarantee they'd have all the books she needed. Still, she'd have to check it out. It was almost time to get Kazan ready to socialize, and Lithia needed info on Agric's dragons, which meant it was time to talk to Albrandt, who was already out walking Kazan. Weirdly, after the whole knife thing, Lithia felt super awkward around him. Still, Lithia knew a lot of the Agric's dragon records were lost, so she needed the Duke's knowledge. Everything he learned raising his dragon. The guy was actually down to spill everything he knew, so there was no need to sweat it. Lithia knew the Duke's experience was the most important thing right now, but she wasn't used to being taken care of. Still, it was pretty nice, and it didn't get in the way of her thinking. Overall, her request sounded pretty reasonable, but she wasn't sure if the Duke trusted her enough to share intel. But while the guy was in a good mood, she decided to ask permission to build a training enclosure and use the storage space. The idea was interesting, so the Duke gave the butler instructions about the library, but he needed to think about the enclosure. Besides, she'd said Kazan should live with other dragons, and now she'd changed her mind. That's right, but he'll only live with other dragons after training and socializing, because he has some seriously strong likes and dislikes. It's totally possible that's why Lithia's working so hard. She didn't deny it, since it was one of the reasons she agreed to become a personal trainer in the duchy. Rohannes got where the girl was coming from, but he also knew his dragon was really touched by her attempts to retrain Louis. Except, that wasn't really the issue, because Louis is a female, so Kazan was just giving her more attention and being more patient. And the Duke realized his favorite dragon was into a female of another species. Just the thought of it really ticked the dragon off. He got all worked up, and it was hard to tell if he was angry or just embarrassed. Lithia watched Kazan's reaction closely, because she'd never seen anything like it before. Plus, Kazan kept telling his master he didn't like any females. But if that was the case, the trainer couldn't figure out why he was acting up. Evening came, and Albrandt got word that Lithia was in the library. Weird how that girl was always holed up in there, practically every day. Part of him thought keeping tabs on her was dumb, but he still couldn't totally trust her either. So, he wasn't about to let her out of his sight. Not when you gotta stay sharp every second in his territory. But from what he's gathered about the girl, she's only interested in the dragons, and doesn't seem to have any ulterior motives. He wondered, yet again, could he really trust Lithia? Or was this just another woman's trick? But a lot of other trainers seemed harmless at first, then showed their true colors. And if this girl hurts Kazan, he'll never forgive her. Just then, Baskal walked into the main character's office with a stack of documents. The man wasn't alone. Emerald was with him. The panther hound was gorgeous, but you could tell she still wasn't used to things, and mostly stayed hidden from other people. What's more, she doesn't cuddle, waits for her owner to leave before eating, basically showing her distrust in every way. Because of that, Baskal even forgot sometimes that he had such an awesome creature. Still, right now, she was rubbing against his legs with her muzzle, trying to get his attention. That kind of behavior was totally out of character for her, so Baskal was surprised. But that wasn't the main thing right now. He brought his Duke a stack of documents that needed reviewing. Basically, all these papers show a rise in efficiency when it comes to managing dragons and their handlers. There was a lot more about Lithia's successes, but the Duke was worried about whether she could be trusted. His friend's opinion mattered. He was scared that sooner or later she'd turn on them. Unfortunately, Baskal couldn't give a completely positive answer, nor could he say for sure that she would. Seeing his old friend's hesitation, Baskal suggested keeping an eye on Lithia. Plus, he had a few questions for her about Emerald's training. The guy was hoping such a talented person wouldn't turn out to be a backstabber. So, if Rohannes was having a hard time deciding, he could leave it to him. The very next day, Baskal went to Lydia and asked for her help with training a tracker panther. The girl was happy to help the young man, since she was also interested in that type of creature. Okay, so the situation was a little weird, because tracker panthers don't usually ditch their patrons. But for some reason, his panther was nowhere to be seen. That's why she wanted to get the details first, because as far as she knew, nobody ever had problems with tracker panthers. The guy was silent for a second, but then he summoned Emerald. Turns out, he misspoke. There wasn't anything wrong with Emerald herself. The problem was him. This dude doesn't always get his pet's feelings, and the panther only opens up when they're alone, but those moments are super rare. Then, out of nowhere, the panther walks up to the main character and starts sniffing her hand. At first, Bascal tried to stop her, but Lithia wouldn't let him. Then she sat down next to the panther and started listening to her. Emerald liked that and gave Lithia an approving nudge. Honestly, Bascal didn't expect Emerald to approach the trainer first. What's more, Lithia wanted him to get specific about the task. She needed to figure out what this dragon liked and didn't like. He couldn't answer that. He figured they were just roommates. He gives the panther a roof and food, and she protects him. Lithia understood more than he was saying, so she asked if she could observe Emerald to pick up on her signals. That was exactly what Bascal wanted, so she got all the permissions she needed. In that case, he'd need to stick around the girl for a while. Even though they shook on the deal, Lithia had a weird feeling about it. So the observation began. Bascal thought, if she's a spy, she'll try to swipe the documents I left out in plain sight. Except she didn't do anything like that, and he couldn't figure out why Rohaness was so wary of her. It was clear to everyone that she was only interested in the dragons. Even now, no matter where she looks, her gaze always ends up back on Emerald. The only thing he'd figured out was that she didn't like being indoors, but he was surprised when she drew some conclusions about his situation. So, Lithia walked up to the young man and told him he needed to pet Emerald every time she looked at him, because that's the most effective way to show your affection. You gotta understand, like, His Highness's dragon is like a big puppy. He comes right up when he wants some love. But Emerald doesn't show her emotions so openly. They're harder to catch, so it's normal that the guy can't fully understand her. Now was the perfect opportunity to take the first step and pet the panther. Bascal did it, and Emerald started acting more affectionate toward her owner. At that moment, Lithia pulled Bascal away from petting the panther, asking if Emerald had changed a lot as she grew up. It was pretty hard for the young man to gauge how withdrawn his dragon was, but compared to when she was a kid, she'd become way more reserved. She used to be this cute, funny little kitten, but now she's a full-grown predator standing right in front of them. Now she was majestic, commanding respect, but still had that attitude and was hard to connect with. Lithia knew perfectly well that even if she was calmly accepting her owner's touch right now, she was still a dragon who could tear anyone to shreds. Suddenly, it occurred to her that the young man could take his dragon for walks from time to time, putting his work aside. There was no way to miss the surprise on the man's face, but she stood her ground. Even though the man didn't want to listen, he had to go out into the fresh air, together with the handler and the dragon. The girl was happy to be in the fresh air, as she had been spending all her time indoors watching Emerald, and was very tired. Lithia could clearly see that the panther was benefiting from the walk. She liked stepping on the grass with her soft paws. At that moment, it began to dawn on Bascal that he really hadn't been giving the dragon much time because he was so busy. Lithia understood perfectly well that the Duke's personal assistant spent too much time at work, and watching her owner, the panther didn't ask much of him. Look, a guy's gotta realize, if a panther's chilling at his feet, he needs to step away from work and give her all the attention he can. He needs to pet her, maybe give her a treat, or even better, take her for a walk. That'll do the trick for now. Plus, if a guy shows a little more affection on those walks, it's a win-win for everyone. Even now, if Bascal just looked closely, he'd see one happy dragon lady. Right then, the guy noticed that watching his pet was seriously tough on Lithia, but she handled the situation like a pro. Truth is, Emerald wasn't the problem. It was Bascal, who didn't know how to approach her. So, he needed to go to Lithia for everything. Suddenly, he burst out laughing, saying Lithia was one amazing person. Then he bowed low, offering her his sincerest apologies. The truth is, he only asked for advice so he could hang out with her. That was a pretty speech. But Lithia knew it was all about keeping her in line. What was weird was why this guy was spilling the beans so easily. Simple. He figured out she's a dragon fanatic who walks the straight and narrow, not into backstabbing. That stung a little, and she was about to bail. But Bascal stopped her, asking if she knew why the Duke trusted him with Emerald. It wasn't just about security. It's that His Grace doesn't trust anyone inside the duchy. Besides, Bascal was betting she'd already heard the story about Ulyss Albrandt. Eulis was executed along with his wife, and then power landed in the hands of a 12-year-old kid, so every aristocrat thought it was their duty to try and knock him off his perch. So Pascal totally gets how tough it is living under suspicion, but Rohannes just didn't have a choice. Interesting story, but Lithia didn't get why he was telling her all this. It's simple. If Lithia were just some average Joe, Pascal wouldn't bother. But she's been busting her butt, training assistants, helping Dern, and a whole lot more. Besides, she never touched any important documents in the guy's office. That just proves she wasn't in it for the money, and she's trustworthy. Lithia needs to understand that Rohannes is going to be suspicious of her for a long time. It even took him years to earn my trust back. Still, he asked Lithia to understand his old friend's caution and not take it personally. Just then, Duke Albrandt showed up in the park. The dude didn't understand the scene he was walking into. Why his buddy was down on one knee in front of his personal animal handler. He was clearly not happy with what he saw. It's the middle of the workday, and Lithia and Pascal should be working, not goofing off. The girl tried to explain that Pascal had asked for some tips about dragon training, which set the Duke off. The guy figured she obviously wasn't busy enough. That was the first time Lithia ever felt something sinister coming from Rohannes. And he kept going, pointing out how she's been quietly racking up dragons under her wing, like he totally underestimated her game. But that wasn't it at all. She only agreed to help Master Pascal because he just needed a few pointers. The guy wasn't buying it, saying no way would anyone waste a whole week glued to Pascal's side just for some advice. Those kinds of digs really got under Lithia's skin. Seeing things were about to blow up, Pascal jumped in, saying Lithia was helping him with Emerald, which is why they were getting along so well. Besides, Pascal was in the doghouse for not getting his report to the Duke on time, so maybe this time he could just look the other way. Part of the Duke understood perfectly, but another part of him was wrestling with feelings he just couldn't put his finger on. Lithia could sense something was off, so she told Rohannes to just spit it out if he had a problem with her. He didn't say a word, just turned around and walked away, leaving her totally confused. What's more, stuff like this is going to happen pretty regularly, and Lithia's just going to have to swallow some unfairness. That all sounds like she should just pack it in, quit, and run away from the duchy. Except she can't exactly run, seeing as Kazan accepted her, just like he accepted the Duke back in the day. And that's probably the biggest thing, because the Duke's been taking risks his whole life and couldn't trust anyone, always expecting a double cross. But Kazan was always there for his grace, and now he's accepted Lithia too. Now the girl's starting to understand Albrandt a little better, living in a world where he can only trust his dragon. Come to think of it, the Duke's life could be the basis for some novel where he's the main character. And she'd totally read that story. She was so lost in thought, she didn't even notice when the Duke stopped in front of her. He's done flying for the day, so Kazan can be taken back to the enclosure. Suddenly, the guy asked her if she'd managed to train Emerald like Pascal asked. The question was weird, and she didn't get why she had to answer him. Still, she replied, saying there weren't any major issues between Pascal and his dragon, so they didn't need any further behavioral adjustments. But if Emerald wasn't a tracker, and if Master Pascal hadn't raised her from a hatchling, things could have gone south real fast. Lithia also figured that Pascal's got too much on his plate, and he just doesn't have the time to hang out with the dragon. Emerald's loyal to the guy and sees him as a parent, but who knows how long that'll last. But if Master Pascal had more time to take care of Emerald, then there wouldn't be any problems. That was an interesting take, but Lithia was overstepping her bounds. Yeah, she's the royal trainer now, but that doesn't give her the right to butt into stuff that ain't her business, though maybe she's got her own reasons. Lithia didn't have a clue what the young man was talking about. Dude was all, "I hired you to train dragons, not get sidetracked with who knows what." That's when some seriously messed up thoughts flooded her brain, and she got mega pissed at the Duke. She didn't have a single second for that kind of stuff. How could he even imagine it? The more she thought about it, the clearer it became. There was absolutely no way she and Pascal could ever be a thing. Besides, her schedule was totally booked solid, zero room for romance. Yeah, she'd just run into a panther tracker for the first time, barely had time to check it out, so the Duke's complaints were way out of line. Look, she was hired as a trainer. That's all she's been doing, and he needs to get it through his head. She's a trainer here, not some damsel. She's always been dedicated to her job, and she plans to keep it that way. So if Rohannes has even a shred of respect for her as a trainer, he'll never make those kinds of insinuations again. After talking to her, the Duke was seriously rattled, He couldn't even focus on the important paperwork. There was a point where he thought he was slowly losing his damn mind. He had no clue why he'd said those things to Lithia, especially knowing Pascal's plans. But seeing them together, for some reason, it just rubbed him the wrong way. And the worst part? Lithia was smiling at his friend, and that got under his skin. He felt like he was going crazy, with all this stupid crap flooding his brain. He'd learned the hard way: never open your heart to anyone. Letting your guard down is a death sentence. He'd tried trusting people so many times, and every single time he'd gotten burned. Betrayed, screwed over, or stabbed in the back. But this time, Lithia had touched a nerve. A part of him he thought was long dead. What's more, when she got mad at him for the first time and drew a clear line between herself and Pascal, the Duke felt a wave of relief. Now that he's cooled down a bit, he realizes he's got another reason to apologize to Lithia. Easier said than done, though. Time passed, and she was trying to avoid her boss. But hey, a job's a job. What's more, they were heading to a business meeting together with Ukandir. He was the guy supposed to build the enclosure for His Highness's dragon. Only problem was, Ukandir couldn't read blueprints, so Lithia had to explain everything to him like he was 5. They pretty quickly figured out where the doors would go, where the cage is, and where the water trough. But Lithia asked the guy to add a clear wall around the outside of the cage. The main goal of the upcoming training was to introduce the dragons to each other. If there's an extra barrier where they can see and smell each other, things should go perfectly. Lithia and the Duke were so lost in thought, they didn't realize they were standing way too close and jumped back like they'd been burned. So, they tried to hide their awkwardness behind business talk. The Duke was ready to shell out for sturdy materials, and they'd use magic to make the wall see-through. They wrapped up the discussion, and Ukandir immediately picked up on the vibe between them. Right then, Lithia just wanted to vanish into thin air. Rohannes was feeling a little weird too, so he wanted to clear a few things up. Lithia couldn't even guess what he was going to say this time, but he just stayed silent. It was weird how he was dragging out the conversation. She had no idea he was battling himself inside, trying to get over his own hang-ups to talk about what happened. And after steeling himself, he choked out a single word of apology. The guy remembered every hurtful thing he'd said to her, so he felt like he had to apologize. Part of her accepted his apology, but another part knew he didn't really have anything to apologize for. Yeah, she had a rough day, but she's just an employee. The Duke doesn't need to bow down to her that easily. I mean, if the only beast tamer in the whole duchy isn't considered top tier, it makes her judgment look like garbage. Honestly, it's not the first time she's heard stuff like that, so she's used to it. Her response was colored by some bad experiences back in Ashur, but she sincerely apologized to the guy for being so out of line. That's why he should never have to lower himself to her level. Overall, her experience with nobles has been pretty awful, but looking at the Duke, she couldn't help but apologize. He was different. He saw things differently. He valued the Tamer, because not many could handle an Agrix dragon. Plus, he knew he messed up, had no right to say what he said, and hoped Lithia could forgive him. It was hard to stay mad at a Duke like that, so her heart melted a little. So the conflict was basically over, but they both still felt kinda awkward. The girl left, and Rohannes was lost in thought, totally clueless about his feelings for Lithia. Was he just stoked to find a decent trainer, or was there something more to it? Meanwhile, the dragon training program was in full swing. Lithia watched the whole thing unfold from the sidelines. Durna was with her, keeping an eye on the training, especially worried about the trainee trying to handle that wild runner dragon. He was getting better at it every single minute. That's why Lithia wasn't worried at all. She was proud of her student, who managed to tame that wild runner dragon. Certificates didn't matter. His experience was the key to his success. Overall, Lithia was happy with her students and the progress they were making. Truth is, the kid wasn't even making mistakes, so he had nothing to sweat about, while another trainee was gearing up to handle a different dragon. Besides, she was curious to learn her students' secrets, so she could use them in her own training. Then, out of nowhere, she felt sick. Her nose started bleeding, but she insisted she was fine, and everyone should just chill out. That's when all the other students rushed over to her. They figured she'd been pushing herself too hard, and was just plain exhausted, which is why she was getting a nosebleed. But she held up her hand and told everyone to stop fussing. She was totally okay. She told them all to get back to what they were doing, but nobody wanted to leave. They all wanted to help. Thing is, she didn't need a doctor, but a hand feeding the dragons would be awesome. Now, Only Madame Durna was left with Lytia, rummaging through her magic case for a potion to stop the bleeding. The weird thing was, Lydia wasn't tired enough to be getting nosebleeds. But, all things considered, at some point, it seemed to her like she'd bitten off more than she could chew. What's worse, these kinds of episodes started happening more and more, even when she was just doing paperwork. And if the Duke finds out about this, he'll freak. At that moment, a drop of blood fell on the table. Lucky it was just that the exam questions weren't ruined. She knew perfectly well the exam had to happen in the spring, so time was running out. There were some seriously promising kids among the students, and if some of them get licensed and stay in the dukedom, it'll be a huge boost for the Duke. She was so lost in thought, she didn't see Pascal up ahead and bumped right into him. He was worried about Lythia, but she told him she was fine. It's just a little nosebleed, happens all the time. But Pascal didn't think that was it. The girl was way too pale. Lythia ignored the comment though, and making some excuse about urgent business, took off. Right then, she couldn't help but remember the Duke's loaded hints, which just made the whole situation even worse. Only she rushed around too fast and suddenly felt super dizzy. On top of that, her nose started bleeding again, and she was like, "What the heck is going on with me?" It was obvious her body couldn't handle the stress anymore, and she needed to rest ASAP, but she didn't even make it to her room before she blacked out. Meanwhile, the Duke was chilling with Kazan in the park, but his peace and quiet got busted up by one of Lythia's students. The Duke didn't really pay him any mind, until Kazan suddenly got all worked up and started growling. So the Duke hopped on his back, and they took off towards the castle. The guy was totally confused about what was up with his dragon. He'd never seen him act like this before. As soon as he got closer, it became clear the reason was Lythia, who was lying there unconscious. Albrecht held her close, totally lost as to what just happened. Kazan was just as messed up, growling, trying to get his pain across. Looking at his winged buddy, Rehanes knew they had to get Lythia to a healer, stat. Before you knew it, a whole squad of healers rushed into the room to give our girl the help she needed. They jumped right into action, with the Duke watching their every move. After a while, the examination was done, and the guy asked them to explain what was up with the animal trainer. From all the signs, it looked like the girl was completely burned out. Plus, if she wasn't so naturally tough, she would have passed out a long time ago, so now she seriously needed to recover. What's more, she needs to stay in bed and take it easy for at least a week. Albrecht was all for it, and he ordered the healers to make sure she rested, didn't get up, and didn't try to rush back to work. And if she gets stubborn, one of them's gonna have to call him. The doctors figured the Duke was worried, 'cause Lythia was the only beast tamer in the duchy. But it was way more complicated than that. Just then, Kazan's head popped in through the window. He was freaked out about Lythia too. The guy understood what his dragon was feeling, and tried to reassure him the girl would be all right. Morning came, and Lythia woke up, not in her own room again. Right then, one of the doctors came in and told her she was in the hospital, and the Duke brought her in after finding her passed out. Hearing that, Lythia jumped out of bed and was going to get dressed quick to get back to her duties. But her plans were shot to hell when the Duke showed up in the room and stopped her. Right now, the Duke didn't give a damn about Lythia wanting to work. Her health was what mattered, and the doc thought she needed more rest. So the guy carried her back to bed, and just then, Kazan's snout appeared in the window. He missed that girl so damn much, he couldn't wait another second to give her a little smooch. Nobody saw that coming. Lythia knew her charge was freaking out, so she decided to calm him down a bit. Meanwhile, the doctor couldn't figure out how a dragon even got into the clinic in the first place. The trainer was sure Kazan raised hell until the Duke finally agreed to take him along. That much was clear, but she needed to realize that if she didn't take care of herself, she'd be stuck in the infirmary for a long, long time. The doctors and Lythia reached a compromise, but the dragon had to get out of here ASAP. The guy and girl were alone in the room. She promised him she'd take better care of herself from now on. Just then, Lythia screamed. She realized her study materials were trashed. No sweat, though, because the Duke gathered the papers, stacked them up, and handed them to Bruce. Part of her was stoked about the news, but she also knew she was the only certified trainer in the whole duchy. Easy fix then, just hire more trainers. Of course, Lythia was stressing about it, but that was a man's problem. He'd figure it out. So, she needed to focus on getting better, and not clutter her brain with stuff she didn't need to worry about. For a second, she wondered if the Duke was worried about her, or just giving her a hard time. A whole week went by, and Lithia was still stuck in the hospital, which meant Kazen and Rohannes were seriously bummed. He knew the dragon missed his trainer, but if he went to the infirmary, her recovery would be dragged out even longer. So, he just flopped onto the floor, turned his back on his master, and sulked. The Duke was thinking that lately, he was totally swamped and couldn't get his own stuff done because he was single-handedly taking care of Kazen. But Lithia being sick and gone wasn't just hitting the Duke hard. Everyone in the castle was feeling it since Lewis's training was on hold. Things weren't exactly smooth sailing back at the training center either. It felt like the whole duchy was collapsing without Lithia, even though they'd basically just gone back to square one. But the guy wasn't backing down. The girl needed rest and recovery, even if it meant everyone else had to pick up the slack. Because she wasn't just the only licensed animal handler, she was also a smart, stand-up woman. What's more, Rohan finally realized in that moment that he really missed her. So, he decided to go check on her. But he didn't want to bring Kazina along. He finally admitted to himself that his conscience was eating him up because he'd been pushing her too hard without knowing the full story. But as he was rushing to the infirmary, he saw Lithia walking in the park with Pascal and Emerin. And that just set him off, because he thought she should be resting in the infirmary, not strolling around the park with his assistant. The situation was awkward, so Pascal tried to lighten the mood. Still, Albrecht wasn't backing down. He was trying to figure out why Lithia wasn't in bed. Turns out, the healer had given the girl permission to get some fresh air in the park. Pascal added that no matter who the patient was, being cooped up inside all the time wasn't good for them. But his grace didn't buy it. There was a dragon involved in this walk, and Lithia was a dragon tamer, so he had a hard time believing she was resting. Just then, the girl clung to the panther. She hadn't seen a single dragon in days, and she was feeling genuinely happy. So there was no way she was giving this awesome little dragon back to the Duke. Seeing how much Lithia liked Emerald, Albrecht asked Pascal to let the girl keep the panther for a while. Except Lithia didn't want to separate the panther from its owner, which meant Pascal had to stick around. As soon as she said it, the main character realized how that sounded. And Rohan's face made it clear he was not happy. He was absolutely seething. So, he started leaning on the girl again, saying if she didn't get back to her room, they'd drag out her recovery time. That's when Pascal stepped in to smooth things over. The guy reminded his buddy that being bedridden for too long isn't good either, which is why the doc gave Lithia the green light to go to the park. Then he leaned in and whispered that people need to voice their feelings, or no one will get them. That was solid advice. The Duke needed to chew on that. Just then, Pascal walked into his office, papers in hand, apologizing for being late. The Duke wasn't about to waste time on chit-chat, so he got straight to the point. He wanted to hire another trainer, but it was super tough, since they needed someone with a spotless record. And let's be real, finding another trainer like Lithia was a long shot. Albrecht knew that perfectly well. But he didn't need another Lithia. He needed someone to back her up. Right then, Pascal pointed out that no one can read Rohannes' mind, especially when Lithia's involved. In other words, the guy needed to stop digging himself a hole and just be honest. But as usual, the young dude pretended he didn't get what his old friend was saying. But Pascal reminded him that if he'd just said he was worried about the girl's well-being, she would have accepted his concern. Okay, enough with the feelings. Time to get back to business, namely finding a trainer. The Asher Training Center seemed like a decent enough place. Yeah, the director was taking kickbacks from some count who was helping out his son, but nothing else came up in the audit. So, that's where the Duke planned to find some suitable trainers. Plus, the Duke was planning on bringing Lithia with him when he went to this training center. Pascal knew the Duke didn't really need to bring Lithia along, but the young man was still so clueless and didn't understand his true feelings. 5 more days passed. Lithia was discharged from the infirmary, and the first thing she did was go check on Kazan. The dragon was super happy to see her too. They started hugging. They were just that damn happy. The girl thanked the dragon for finding her unconscious and carrying her to the infirmary. Only now did she realize how badly she'd scared this strong, handsome dragon, seeing someone he cared about bleeding out. So now she could let him be a little grumpy and blow off some steam from the last few days. Plus, she just had a brilliant idea. They could fly together. It was the best decision she'd made in a while, and it made them both happy. Flying with Kazan was a refined and ultimate pleasure for Lithia. Duke Albrecht watched them from the ground with a smile. As soon as they landed back on solid ground, Lithia noticed they weren't alone in the clearing. The young man reminded her that she'd just left the infirmary, so she needed to take care of herself and not throw herself back into work. Lithia knew the Duke sounded cold, but deep down, he was really worried about her. She wasn't stressed, though. It had been too long since she'd flown, and being high in the sky with Kazan felt amazing. A guy might take that the wrong way, but for now, Lydia's gonna hold off on dragon feeding and focus on training. If that's the case, she could just grab Kazan and head home. Rohannes can handle the rest. It was clear Lydia totally missed the guy's good intentions and got offended. Even so, the Duke stopped her and told her he was heading to the imperial capital soon. He's going there to find some top-notch trainer candidates for his duchy, and he wants Lydia's help with the selection. That was a total curveball, and she wasn't really sure how she could help the Duke. But her involvement was settled. They're heading to the capital in 3 weeks, and until then, she needs to get her strength back. Just then, the Duke saw her happy smile and knew he'd made the right call. Time flew by, but her assistants wouldn't let her study for the exam, or even get near feeding the dragons. They all thought they were doing the right thing, especially since Lithia had already passed out from exhaustion once. They weren't about to let that happen again. The rest definitely did her good, but looking at the Duke now, she was getting a bad feeling. Seriously, she couldn't figure out why she had to ride in the carriage with him instead of watching over Kazan. He didn't care that Lithia didn't want to ride with him. Sitting face to face with the boss was pure torture for her, but she had to follow her employer's orders. At least Kazan looked totally calm, even though his special training hadn't even started yet. Plus, a few assistants were escorting them on dragon steeds. All in all, this trip was shaping up to be one for the books. Rohannes suddenly realized Lithia might be super uncomfortable riding with him, so they'd need to get another carriage on the way back. She's finally asleep, so there's a good chance we won't need that second carriage after all. But he was worried about her being uncomfortable, so he decided to adjust her position a bit on the seat. Just then, they hit a rock and the carriage jolted. But the young man managed to pull the girl close, stopping her from falling. Except, she started acting kinda weird, kissing him on the shoulder. It was just a simple gesture, but it unleashed a whirlwind of feelings he'd never felt before. Emotions that were hard to control and understand. So, at some point, he gently pushed Lithia away, explaining that the carriage had hit a bump and the wheel jumped. Besides, they were almost at the capital, so it was time to wake up anyway. As they entered the city, Lithia realized that the training center they were headed to was Ashar, where she used to work. The man explained that they were only here because this center was under the Empire's protection, so it was less likely to be shady than the others. Lithia wasn't exactly sold on calling this place clean, but she wasn't about to argue with her boss, so she went to keep an eye on Kazan. She told the dragon to chill out and not freak out the humans or the other dragons. Just then, her old buddy from back when she worked at Ashar ran up to her. She was stoked to see her old friends, but then Rohannes showed up behind her and totally killed the vibe. Lithia had to get Kazan settled, then head to the director's office where the Duke was waiting for her. She didn't get why she had to sit in on business talks. She'd rather hang with the dragon. But halfway to the office, she heard a voice that was sickeningly familiar. A real nasty one. It was none other than her worst enemy, Thompson. She was like, "What's he doing here?" Last she heard, he got the boot after that whole thing went down. Guess not. And of course, the dude started running his mouth, saying she'd, charmed the Duke, and now she's strutting around like she owns the place. He figured, since the girl was back at the training center, the Duke must have kicked her out. So he thought he'd show a little pity and take her under his wing. He started coming onto her stronger, even getting handsy, saying he liked girls with a bit of fire in them, the feisty type. But Lithia wasn't having any of it. She knew there was nothing worse than turning to a guy who only had his family name to brag about, 'cause that's all he had going for him. So he better cut the creepy act right now and let her pass. Even better, he should go do his actual job. Maybe then he'd be a halfway decent excuse for a man. Thompson got so mad he was about to punch Lithia, but the punch never landed. Duke Albrandt stepped in and protected her. His eyes blazed with fury. The drawn sword made it clear this guy wasn't messing around when it came to protecting what was his.